what is the meaning of being? After all, everything just is. Why should there be a problem? It doesn't seem to be a problem. Everything is, and the things that aren't. So I want to try to explain today why Heidegger thinks that is such an important question. And I'll remind you of his orientation, especially the second quotation. The first we talked about yesterday, meaning, Sinn in the German, is thereby clearly delineated conceptually as that from which and on the grounds of which being in general can become manifest, in this very unusual Heideggerian expression, can come into truth. The problem of the meaning of being, I tried to suggest yesterday, is for Heidegger the problem of the meaningfulness of being. That is, beings in the way they matter to us in experience. Their way of mattering is their original way of being available in experience. They become salient to us in an unreflective familiarity permeated by degrees of significance. It is how beings originally show up for us in experience. The source of that meaningfulness, the meaningfulness of individual beings, is the possibility of meaningfulness as such at a time. And that means the possible meaningfulness of anything at all, and being as such. That is, this general relation between the possibility of meaningfulness of being at all and the way entities mean something to us is not a matter of conceptual necessity, but of, and here is the central really issue in Heidegger, what he calls the problem of primordiality, fundamentality. And this is established, demonstrated to us that the problem is the fundamental problem in the being in time project, phenomenologically, not deductively or conceptually. There is a profound difference in Heidegger in the two regimes of the question of meaningfulness, and that's what Heidegger called the ontological difference. That our original attunement to such possible meaningfulness has been lost or forgotten, or at best deeply obscured, is how Heidegger wants to characterize our destitute time, a time of homelessness. The meaning of being has been reduced to the mere perceivable presence of beings, the kind of fairly meaningful form of intelligibility. Not a delimited form of intelligibility, but a delimited form of meaningfulness. In this lecture, I want to explain what I think Heidegger means by these claims. That is, Heidegger claims that the dominant understanding of being since antiquity has been what he calls standing presence, what is simply present or at hand in the present and enduring through a sequence of presence. As I said at the beginning, beings just are. And they are by virtue of being detectable in some way by us or by our instruments. But this does not mean that this is the definition, meaningfulness for us now, of what the word or a concept means. Such a notion is available within the world in its significance. That meaning, and what originally discloses us, is that beings are available to us in the modern age, usable for us, objects for us, material for our manipulation and control. Beings show up because their intelligibility like that has come to matter to us, and this in terms of their manipulability. Hence, the claim that Heidegger's question is what it means to be, or what it means to be a being, is far too elliptical and misleading a way of characterizing his projects. It sends us to questions of linguistic meaning or conceptual clarification, and Heidegger never tires of denying that this is his interest. There is certainly a sense in Heidegger of what it means to be, but in being in time, that phrase amounts to what it means to me to be, to exist. And this within a historical horizon of what it could mean to anyone at a time. In his later work, his attention shifts somewhat from the former emphasis, to me, to the latter, what it is and how we are open to a historical horizon of possible meaningfulness. In his 1927 lecture course, The Basic Problems of Phenomenology, Heidegger is unambiguous about what he considers to be the basic philosophical problem. We assert now that being is the proper and the sole theme of philosophy. Philosophy itself is said to be the science of being. That Heidegger believes this is unambiguous. No philosopher has ever concentrated so intensely on one question for the entirety of his 50-plus year career. But the first question for any student of Heidegger is simply what the question concerns, which in the 1920s was said to address the meaning of being, the Sinn des Seins. Is the question of the meaning of being even a question? That is, a question with a possible answer. This issue is made more difficult because Heidegger is eager to qualify and to some extent marginalize the usual and much more familiar semantic ways that philosophers address the problem, the various senses of the word is, the copula. His word for such an approach is logic, or a logical understanding of the meaning of being via analysis of the copula. For Heidegger, neither the is of existence, there are bears in those woods, the is of predication, the bears in those woods are black, nor the is of identity, the black bear is the one who ate my strawberries, is adequate as a path to such an issue. They all presuppose a fundamental meaning of being qua being, already assume that bears, woods, and colors are available in experience, and he means this to be understood as in some meaningful way. They manifest themselves as what they are. Moreover, it is not just linguistic or semantic meaning that Heidegger excludes as his topic. That's why the issue is so hard to get a handle of. He just rejects so many of the familiar philosophical ways of approaching the issue. If the question is the meaning of being, and as a question of meaning, it would seem natural to begin by appreciating that meaning is what we understand, for example, in attending to another's vocalizations, what they say, or that meaning is what we come to understand when someone's actions seem unintelligible to us until we learn what her ends are and her intentions are to achieve it. Or meaning in philosophy is understood in an intentionality context where it means determinate content, the meaning of something intended in consciousness as such as consciousness being onto a determinate content. Thus, when we say we understand the meaning of what she is saying or what she is doing, or we understand a determinate content of an intention, it would therefore seem natural to understand the question of the meaning of being as asking what someone means to say when he says something exists or declares what the meaning of some action is, declares it to be what it is, just that action, or that he is aware of that object as such and not anything else. Because it is understood as such and not anything else, it is meaningful in the sense of intelligible. If we respond that Heidegger always considers such formulations as what he calls derivative and ontic matters that leave the basic question unclarified, then we think he wants us to ask what it means to be at all in this semantic or intentional sense of meaning. But he tells us that such formulations assume the answer to the question he's trying to pose, and so don't point away towards addressing it. It assumes that the question is fundamentally about the criterion of existence. And that means the answer has to be that something is present at hand, or as he will say, a content as such is present to consciousness. Moreover, as we saw in the previous lecture, if Heidegger's lifelong claim is that forgetting the question of the meaning of being is a catastrophic event in the history of mankind, that it leads to nihilism and a predatory, self-destructive technical manipulation of the earth, it's extremely hard to see how one can claim that this has come about because we don't have an adequate philosophical account of what we mean when we say something is. The forgetting of the meaning of being, he says in the Nietzsche lectures, is the age of complete meaninglessness, Sinnlosigkeit. So any retrieval of the question must be a path towards a renewed sense of the meaningfulness of being. Accordingly, we must keep in mind that in any of Heidegger's we must keep this in mind in any of Heidegger's formulations about the problem of being. But where do we begin? We can't begin by what is often understood in philosophy by the question of being in any of its other senses. His is not a question of ontological commitment. The question that's familiar in philosophy of what beings are there, or what kinds of beings are there? Is there a God? Are there minds? Are there souls? And he does not ask what makes it possible for beings to be the determinate beings they are. How can they be what they are and be differentiated from other beings? That is, what is it to be a mind or a soul? He says his question is more primordial, the meaning of being, and he insists that that question is presupposed by all the others. If we ask, what is a mind? We already assume we know what it means to be something or other. So it's presupposed when we ask the question of ontological commitment. As we saw yesterday, he does not even mean what must be true of anything at all, being itself, such that Aristotle's question, ti esti, what is it, could be asked of any particular thing or kind. Being in Plato is eidos, being in Aristotle is form. That's what answers that question. That's how it's possible. Being is fundamentally form, idea. That's how it's possible that anything could be the determinate thing it is. This is to ask the question of the meaning of being in a way that takes its bearings from all the beings, what Heidegger calls Sein entities, a point of orientation that, just as before, already assumes such some unacknowledged answer to the meaningfulness of being questions. It assumes that entities are thing-like presences, and they matter to us in that form. What is common in Heidegger's early works, by which I mean the Marburg and Freiburg lectures, such as the Basic Problems of Phenomenology, 1927, Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics, 1929-30, 1929 lectures on German idealism, the 1930 lectures on Hegel's phenomenology, and his publications of the period, like Being in Time, Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics in 29, The Question Concerning the Thing, 35, is the first thing we have to understand is revolutionary revision of Husserlian phenomenology. This story is by now a familiar one in intellectual histories of the period. Husserl thought he had invented a method that would allow him to isolate the essential elements in any, what he called, intentional attitude, any consciousness of any object being the attitude it was, and any kind of content being the kind of content it was. And he thought he had developed the resources to account for the minimal conditions of the possibility of such intentional relations. As Husserl pointed out, our consciousness is always the consciousness of something. And in any such intending in various modalities, perceiving a red block, hating a political leader, hoping for a win, loving a friend, imagining a future, believing a promise, these are all intentional attitudes towards intentional content, as Husserl understands them. We can distinguish, Husserl argues, between a mental attitude, a mode of description, and the object. We can both love a friend, I under one description, you under another. We can both imagine Paris, you under a description, I with a particular image, but both intending Paris. This possibility, such intentionality, Husserl argues, is prior, logically prior, to the distinct sort of theoretical spectatorship or sociological inquiry into objects undertaken by a science. We presuppose we understand what it means to be able to intend such an object in that way successfully at all. And that's what philosophy should be about. First philosophy, how that's possible that consciousness can be onto a determinate content. Under one modality, hoping, fearing, seeing, believing, and the particular kind of content appropriate to that. How is it possible? What are the conditions of its possibility? The latter, the particular enterprises undertaken by the sciences, all presuppose the form that consciousness could be onto objects in the first place. Husserl proposed a way of isolating this issue in philosophy, what he called a phenomenological reduction, whereby the question of the existence of the intended object would be suspended. Only its being for consciousness should be our focus, he said. And then what he called the transcendental reduction, wherein the essences of such possible stances and possible kinds of objects could then be found. Now, Husserl has a great influence on Heidegger, who was his student and was his successor in Freiburg when Husserl retired. And there is in the later Husserl a great similarity between Husserl's despair that the question of the very possibility of the sciences in philosophy had been abandoned in favor of a general acceptance of the obviousness of the theoretical spectatorship attitude of the modern sciences. And he said there was a crisis in European intellectual thought because of this forgetting. So there's already a theme, and there are many people who think Heidegger kind of appropriated Husserl's later work in Being in Time, and there are many people who think Husserl changed his mind because of the influence of Heidegger in his early work. We need here to understand the fundamental question again. Only the main results of Heidegger's dissatisfactions with the phenomenological method. The most important is probably the most influential claim in Being in Time. Husserlian intentionality, and indeed all consciousness-based and representational models of intentionality, are all improperly formulated and misleading from the outset. The possibility of such intentionality should rather be understood as requiring not consciousness and a world, but a unit he calls in der Welt sein, being in the world. He just coined this locution, tried to say that there's not the being of consciousness and the being of the world in a relationship we have to connect. There is no such original separation. We exist always already in a world with which we are connected, not one to which we must make a connection by establishing the possibility of intentionality. A subject conscious of a distinct object model should be replaced by an inseparable subject-object nexus, a subject always transcended in a practical and unthematic original relation to its worldly objects. The fundamental or primordial relation is not one, our relation to the world, the very possible relation to our relation to the world, is not one originally of simple spectatorship or perceptual awareness, although there is such a thing. It's not the fundamental way in which the world is experienced, and it doesn't thus pose the fundamental problem for philosophy as Husserl understands it. But what Heidegger called comportment in our relation to the world, Verhalten, an ongoing, original, active engagement with the world, an involvement that is driven by how things have come to matter, by significance. This is how beings are primarily available to the subject, not as objects to be hooked onto, but as always already involved with us as we are with those objects. The claims is that beings are only accessible to Dasein, again, Heidegger's term for our openness to the meaning of being, other than ourselves and to ourselves, within a world, and for Dasein as the kind of practical being it originally is. So what does he mean by world in this sense? Let us provisionally define world as those beings which are in each case accessible and may be dealt with, accessible in such a way that dealing with such beings is possible or necessary for the kind of being pertaining to a particular being, that is us, Dasein. And from this, it follows that world properly means the accessibility of beings as such. Yet this accessibility is grounded upon a manifestness of beings as such. Finally, it was revealed that this is not a manifestness of just any kind whatsoever, but rather manifestness of beings as such as a whole, within a whole interrelated nexus of meaningfulness he calls world. For Heidegger, world is not the totality of what there is, as in Kant, or of all that is the case, as in Wittgenstein. World is a necessarily presupposed, that is, primordial condition for the possible availability, meaningful accessibility of being within such a world in the first place. A horizon of possible sense or meaningfulness, always within which and in terms of which beings are encountered. These are the consequences Heidegger draws from this claim about being in the world. The notion of availability, primordial availability, as deep familiarity, unreflective familiarity, implies a kind of immediacy in our original encounter with beings in the world, but not like the direct presence of intentional objects as in theories of a pure given. Everything available in this familiarity is already embedded in, understood in terms of, its historical world of possible matterings. This means that such a being is not first encountered as a thing and then interpreted any more than a string of sounds is first heard as sounds and then interpreted as language. This implies a kind of immersion in a field of possible significance, what Heidegger, following the lead of Emil Lask in his early years, called Hingabe, or submission to the world, as well as in context he will describe as also permitting a possible reflexive attentiveness, although secondarily, not originally. So beings as such are accessible to or manifest to Dasein only within a world. We have quite a useful contrasting example in Heidegger's treatment of animals in the fundamental concepts of metaphysics. Animals, Heidegger says, strangely enough, have a world, although he says they are Weltarm, world poor. They barely have a world, but they have a world. That is, for animals, especially higher order animals, beings are meaningfully accessible. They manifest, show up for comporting animals in the way they deal with their world. Beings are primarily available to animals too, as significant, meaningful. The horizon of such a world of possible significance is, though, for them, set by their species form. That provides something like a fixed, non-historical context of relevance in which things are accessible in their significance for the animal. They also don't just encounter or have access to mere objects, although there are plenty around. Many of them mean nothing for the animal and don't show up as salient. Power lines, mining equipment, discarded clothing in their environment. They're not noted. What does mean something is what in its world is set by the life their species forms require. Food, shelter, mates, prey, offspring, and so forth. But in distinction from us, they cannot access prey or food as such. Their world has a minimal level of meaningfulness and a limited range of accessibility. Heidegger says animals are captivated by their objects and driven by instinct, but the things that emerge as salient to them do so because of the distinct features of their world. Our own comportment towards food, for example, is not merely something that shows up to be eaten. We can wonder where it was grown, if it's organic or not. We can maneuver around issues in food as food because beings can show up for us as meaningfully being as such. He doesn't mean that in accomplishing our task, we are constantly reflecting on the beings we are dealing with. It's rather that in dealing with them as such, a range of possibilities is implicitly available as practical possibilities when relevant, all without explicit reflection and not strictly set by our species requirements. Think of all the differences in the way food means various things in various different historical periods and in various different cultures. Not like that for animals, but food shows up for them in a way that power lines or discarded cars don't. Although they can perceive them, they don't run into them. This has important implications for the whole question of what it means to understand other species, especially strange ones like bats. The main implication is that it is a mistake to consider that the right question in such reflection on understanding is, as in a famous American article, what it is like to be a bat. As if we're trying to understand what it's like to be a bat, the goal is somehow to to inhabit imaginatively a bat consciousness, or peer into it, or successfully imagine it. We would have, if that were the case, ignored the bat's world and how things show up for it. We just had this transference of consciousness model of what it is to understand it. For that matter, although that's common in philosophy since modernity, that would be a foolish way to think about how to understand another person, especially since that version of the problem entails a skeptical answer. This is what philosophers call the problem of other minds. How do I know that you're really thinking, inhabiting, perceiving, caring about the same world I do? And the solution to that is supposed to be something like, how can I imagine what it is like for you to experience the world I experience? Once we raise the question that way, skepticism is inevitable. We can't. I mean, it's actually quite a paradoxical enterprise. If I could imagine what it's like to be you, I would either be imagining what it's like for me to be you, or I would become you. And I wouldn't be imagining for myself what it's like to be you. But the problem of other minds, which is not an ancient problem, just like the problem of self-deceit or the problem of skepticism about the external world is not an ancient problem. It's a typically modern problem in the way that Heidegger thinks he can explain. But our understanding of animals is possible not like this, but by means of our engagement with them and our understanding them in such an engagement because of the narrow sort of Venn diagram intersection of the things that matter in our world and the things that matter in their world. I understand my dog's happiness in her playing and swimming, in how she goes about it, not by being able to look into her consciousness. This is not anthropocentric. I'm under no illusions that we share what happiness means in her world and mine, but I understand her nonetheless to be happy in her way. Any of you who have dogs can't deny this fact, I think. I mean, you could say, well, that's what we call happiness, but she really is just engaging in what the neuronal firing is encouraging her to manifest. How did we come to that point where we can't even recognize the simple happiness of a dog or a dog's love, for example? Many philosophers deny there could be any such thing because animals are evolutionarily evolved like dogs to attract affection from humans in a way that because of their dependence, they've learned to manifest signals that get them what they want. How did we ever come to that state where we can't really appreciate that we share a world in which the manifestations of caring, like love, can be in both our worlds? We considerably more overlap with higher mammals and considerably less, but not nothing, with animals like bats. The sharing is evident in our engagement, and the engagement, our being attuned to their way of going on in the world, is what understanding consists in, this overlap. Observing and understanding anything about bats would be impossible without already sharing with them the need for food and water, reproduction, care for the young, and search for shelter. How things show up for them as they do for us. For us, beings as such mean as disclosed to Dasein, and that means in their significance. For Dasein, whose primordial mode of being in the world is not observation, perception, spectatorship, but care, what Heidegger calls Sorge, concern, in this model of the primordiality of practical engagements, a practical investment in the world, attuned to and attentive to significance, importance, and mattering, all implicit in our comportment with beings, deeply familiar and unthematic. Human animals also have a biological species form, of course, but that does not determine the world for Dasein. In a very shorthanded way, we can say that the background world for any possible accessibility and for their own individuation for human beings is a historical world, that we are what Heidegger will call, using another form for openness, a clearing for the possible availability of meaning, a Lichtung, not a species form. Our world is always a specific historical world and a horizon of sense, not mere instinctual attentiveness. Said in a slightly different way, beings are manifest to Dasein as Dasein is in its distinctiveness as a being. He calls that distinctness existence, that the being of, this is a famous claim of the early founding of existentialism, that existence precedes essence, that whatever Dasein is as a biological species form does not set its path in life, that its path in life is open to a wide variety of possibilities that are not set by its biological species form, even understood in the sophisticated way, an Aristotelian way. Its being is existence, this openness to possible meaningfulness limited by a historical world. That distinctiveness is not being a substance or a mind, because the mode of existence is practical. Again, Sorge, care. Dasein, said another way, is what it takes itself to be. It's up to us. Within a world into which it is thrown, over which it has no power to influence. The basic ontological idea here of fundamental ontology, the project of being and time, is that the distinctiveness of Dasein as a being has nothing to do with its unique thing-like properties, but is due to its unique experiential path through the world and time, including such features as its unique capacity to anticipate its own constantly possible death and its sustaining commitments that give its existence a distinct directedness over time. It's always already oriented from matters of significance. This means that primordial access to beings and being as a whole, being as such, is again, as we've been emphasizing, not originally cognitive, not as the object of judgments, but requires instead what Heidegger calls a prior attunement, a Stimmung, an orientation that stems from a primordially practical involvement given the horizon of possible meaningfulness set by a world. Obviously, in a cognitive sense, we can know and say what an MRI machine is, or a molecule, or a cavity, or a poem. We can provide a list of identifying predicates, more or less. But since Heidegger claims we encounter anything we do always with greater or lesser degrees of involvement, it is that involvement within a world that allows meaningful access to the beings that show up in a world. We normally don't just happen upon and try to define an MRI machine. We're being examined, or we're running the machine, or we're repairing it. Even if we are explaining how it works to someone, we care about so defining it in that context, in such a project, and we're never free of such horizons. We might say there are greater or lesser degrees of concern, ranging from whether it is yours or not yours, needed but unavailable, ugly, distasteful, irrelevant, in the way, too near. This would be to say that we can have various degrees of concern that various beings are available, something like varying ways of understanding the meaning of their being at all. Again, the meaning of their being should be understood as the meaningfulness, Bedeutsamkeit, or Dasein of their being at all. And as we saw yesterday, Heidegger admits that this is a certain unique form of idealism. Things can be manifest only to a being open in its way to that manifestation, as that being is and matters. If there were no Dasein, there would, of course, be all the entities there are now, but none of them would mean anything. The world is the condition of availability, what Heidegger often calls a ground for the possibility of what emerges as significant, salient for Dasein. The question of what accounts for things existing at all is not Heidegger's question. This is clear in the opening passages of his book, Introduction to Metaphysics, where Leibniz's question, why is there something rather than nothing, is quickly shown to be derivative, already relying on some answer to questions like, as he says, how do things stand with being, or what is the meaning of being presupposed by any question like that one, why do they exist at all? What have we presupposed about their meaningful availability such that the question could get a grip in the first place? It is because of this reorientation in Heidegger, away from the putative primacy of mere sensory receptivity or observation or theoretical spectatorship, in how beings originally become available, that Heidegger says so many of the other things he does. For example, that metaphysics itself is not to be understood as a conceptual clarification of the possibility of existence, or that element of its task, as he says, is secondary and depends on something of this existential significance. The task of metaphysics instead is said to be awaken the possibility of a fundamental attunement to the world, to awaken us to the realization that we are always already attuned in a way, to call to mind what might be disclosed to us in such a fundamental attunement, a way of being onto, receptive to what matters, and the possibility of mattering that is not an issue of belief or consciousness, but as in the musical sense of being attuned on the right wavelength or appreciatively engaged in this field of mattering. If, say, the cleanliness of a room matters to one will have a belief that it's important, but its mattering in the first place is a matter of finding untidy rooms irritating or anxious making and feeling contented when the room is tidy. These are not, and this is the hardest thing to understand about Heidegger's position, because it seems so obvious that it is. These are not emotional reactions, but how beings in the world originally show up. There is no first step in which they show up, and then an emotional reaction to them. Their mattering is the original way in which they show up. There are no two steps. There's only one step, the way they manifest themselves originally in a context of mattering. At the philosophical level, this sense of being gripped is being intrigued in metaphysics, not by conceptual paradoxes, but by what Heidegger says following Novalis is the condition of all genuine philosophy, homesickness. That is, an uncanniness at our dependence on a regime of mattering whose source is difficult to bring to light and understand, is always originally hidden. I mean, there's the individual question of why things matter to us as they do, given the particular project each of us is engaged with, and the way things show up as mattering because of that concern. But that's delimited within a field of possibility that is not up to us. It can't matter to you to be a samurai, or to be a Greek priest, or to be a medieval monk. People can pretend that it matters, but that has no world. There's no resonance in which it's possible for that to matter. And at the most general level, that possibility is something into which Heidegger says we are simply thrown. The way philosophy has come to matter to some of you has to do with conditions of possible meaningfulness of the late modern Western world that none of us had anything to do with, that we are subject to rather than subjects of, and that we can't dispense with. What that source is, how to allow it to manifest itself, not the way individual things manifest, but how that source for all of this can be possible, is the mystery of the meaning of being for Heidegger. That's his central question, because it's hidden. It isn't available the way things in the world are available. The ontologically significant states that disclose such meaningfulness or such attunements are like anxiety in being and time, where all that matters to us seems to us to be groundless in a moment of great uncertainty and unsettledness, or in the fundamental concepts of metaphysics, boredom, fundamental boredom, where all such mattering, in a sense, fails. And in a brutal contrast, the fundamental and necessary and contingent phenomenon of meaningfulness and manifested as such becomes salient when it fails, when we lose our involvement in the world because it doesn't seem to matter. This could happen, of course, quite suddenly in individual cases. Things that seem to matter to you a great deal suddenly don't. We're, again, subject to this kind of failure of attunement. And Heidegger always insists that such a significance or degrees of mattering, again, cannot be understood as a subject projecting onto otherwise meaningless entities. Again, there are no two steps, an encounter with a mere object and then a subjective projection of value by an individual or community. There are not two steps because there is no first such step. Dasein is always already within the world of meaningfulness. It's the only way things show up for Dasein and bear on it. And here the problem, we can, however, take objects to be available in a way that conflicts with and covers up their actual real availability. Scientism, for example, is like this. The insistence, thanks to the philosophical tradition, that things are manifest for Dasein primarily in their cognitive intelligibility is, as we saw yesterday, another such distortion. That is, in their being rendered intelligible by logos or ratio, all of which is what is brought to that culmination in German idealism in general and Hegel's science of logic in particular, as we'll see in the next lecture. Everyday thoughtlessness is another in ways in which this primordiality of manifestness doesn't show up, is ignored because of a kind of routinization of the ordinary in which thoughtlessness is the primary mode of our simply going on as we go on every day. I should pause here to make a special point of emphasizing the direction of interpretation already cited in the passages cited yesterday and today, and in many that will follow. When Heidegger insists that any question we might raise about any of the beings or any region of being depends on or is already oriented from such originary implicit understanding of the meaning of being, he does not mean a reliance on an implicit view of or belief about what is meaningful or significant, where that is taken to raise the question of how we divide the world into those things that exist or could possibly exist and those that do not or could not, or whether we can have some sort of unfiltered access to the real. He's not proposing to exfoliate a preconceptual, or as he says, pre-ontological understanding of this division, what it is to exist or not. He always says that this would itself presuppose an implied answer to the question he's most interested in, the meaning of being as sketched here, as meaningfulness, Bedeutsamkeit, as mattering in a horizon of what is originally available. Appreciating this fact will, as we'll see, completely alter many of the well-known construals of the problems that are taken to follow from Heidegger's question: skepticism, truth, idealism, intentionality. Heidegger is proposing to shift the main tasks of philosophy from the analysis of the concepts involved in knowledge claims, empirical experience, and moral claims to an interpretive enterprise, at the center of which are these notions of familiarity, Vertrautheit, meaningfulness, Bedeutsamkeit, and care, Sorge. As he tells us, fundamental ontology, not that this is a very helpful phrase, is a hermeneutics of facticity. And for all of the revisions in his language and approach, I don't believe he ever changed his mind about the centrality or fundamentality of such a hermeneutics. This is probably a minor point, but I should mention that for many Heidegger scholars, around the beginning of the 1930s, the publication of an essay called On the Essence of Truth, from Wesen der Wahrheit, Heidegger went through a profound, what they call a care, a turn, in which the problem of the availability of the meaningfulness of being for Dasein was dropped as a central problem. And this question of our access to the source of possible meaningfulness, what we inherit or subject to, became so much the focus of his interest that he lost all connection with the original post-phenomenological, post-Husserlian project of the 1920s and 30s. And in the book in which some of these lectures are derived from, what I'm trying to do is to deny that there is any such care or return. Heidegger himself, of course, said there wasn't, in a famous letter to a huge book on a later Heidegger by Father Richardson, called From Phenomenology to Thought. Heidegger actually wrote a preface to that collection in which he said there's just a deep continuity. And in the book, I'm trying to say what this continuity is about. Another reason it's important to keep this focus is that without it, again, it would be very hard to comprehend what Heidegger proposes that I'm going to talk about on the last lecture, a new way of thinking, and the notion of poetic thinking already on partial view in the basic problems of phenomenology. This means, I think, in the Anglophone tradition, there's something off-center in numerous discussions of whether Heidegger is a realist or an idealist or a deflationary realist or a robust realist or a transcendental idealist. These are all terms in the literature around Heidegger in the Anglophone reception. It's almost irresistibly tempting to consider that the problem of being is the problem of the really real, and whether we have access to it, whether it depends on us for its sense or existence. But as I have begun to argue and will continue to argue throughout, the problem of being for Heidegger in all of his writings bypasses all of those issues, since the problem is the meaningfulness of being, the correlation between meaningfulness and its availability through various different modalities of attunement. That is why the epistemological issue is not prominent in his project. The manifestation of such significance and the way in which such significance matters itself happens as a matter of mattering and is not a problem of idealism and realism, because we're not onto what matters by beliefs or concepts, but by this original different mode of involvement, which he calls attunement. He doesn't deny that our perceptual faculties have to be working, our brain has to be working, our cognitive capacities have to be working, but none of what shows up for us as the meaning of being is as a direct correlate of correct brain functioning or our eyes working properly, because we don't experience the world right now as you're experiencing it as a set of perceptual objects reflecting light rays in the proper way with functioning retinal nerves and the brain. All that has to exist, but it's not Heidegger's question. And it doesn't bear on the question of how things have come to matter. We can give an account like that, say an evolutionary account. But that already assumes that what it is to be Dasein is to be a biological instance of a species. And that's what's at issue. That can't be presupposed. Now, it's easy to imagine, in the spirit of the many things Heidegger says, an objection to this direction he's proposing, that it overcorrects for all the realism, idealism distortions, and leaves us in a simple picture of a world in which some things matter, happen to, and others don't. Something close to what is like philosophical anthropology, what Heidegger fears he will be taken to have defended. But significance or meaningfulness as such, which we could investigate empirically as social anthropologists, for example. The problem of the meaning of being is a mode of the very possibility of the original availability of what is. It's not a psychological or social normative issue. Approaches, again, which presuppose an answer to Heidegger's question. And what is made available, the entities, Zion is what is in their significance and so their availability. And Heidegger's way of posing the question is not meant to be leading to us, and this is very frustrating about him, to a determinate answer. How entities are available in their mattering is endlessly elusive, what he calls a disclosing and concealing that anyone interested in Heidegger has to tackle with. For example, his remarks on the essence of truth, that multiplicity of meanings is the element in which all thought must move in order to be strict thought. Therefore, we must always seek out thinking and its burden of thought in the element of its multiple meanings, else everything will remain closed to us. How we could be onto that is the major problem for Heidegger, and is what will lead him to this concept he proposes as the successor to philosophy, what he calls poetic thinking. All of this is not to mention that Heidegger has no problem with an abstraction from such original availability in the service of measurement, causal explanation, subatomic particle research, and so forth. Heidegger would not be worth studying if he meant to say that all of those things are untrue, a distortion, false, not possible. They just don't address the question of Bedeutsamkeit, of meaningfulness or significance. Whether such access to the real is possible is not his question, because it doesn't address the original availability of the meaning for being. And if that question is forgotten, what he calls nihilism results, by which he means an unreflective kind of lived out meaninglessness in everyday life. My proposal for this continuous reading of Heidegger is that if we keep our eyes on the long continuity of this way of proposing the question, we will be better able to appreciate what he's trying to say, as we saw yesterday, about German idealism, Kant, and Hegel, and so about the fate of philosophy itself. Heidegger's question is not, even in philosophy, a conceptual analysis of the nature of the claim of any ought is not something Heidegger is in effect ruling out. He's just trying to point out that in raising that question without a connection to the issue of the meaningfulness of being, we are dogmatically inheriting a very limited notion of possible meaningfulness, a thing like orientation to substances and properties that would be better off postponing until we have addressed this more fundamental question. There can be, of course, a psychological question about whether what we think matters to us as we might report it is what really matters to us. Sometimes reading a work of great literature or watching a film can disclose that to us, that we find ourselves gripped by something mattering that we thought would not. But that's not Heidegger's concern either. It's secondary and is not excluded. Manifesting in the sense we've been using it is to be understood as emerging or showing up, beings, as he says, announcing themselves, sich melden. as becoming salient. He means to emerge out of concealment, appearing in their significance as such from a kind of background hiddenness, the hiddenness of insignificance, unconcealed by virtue of Dasein's engagement in the public world. As Heidegger increasingly insists throughout the 1930s, manifestus in this sense is what he calls, that is, this original subjection to a horizon of meaningfulness, an event, an Ereignis, he calls it. And in the 1930s, he wrote an extremely obscure, long book called The Beiträge, The Contributions to Philosophy, in which he was trying to understand the way the event of mattering happens at a very, very genuine level rather than a psychological or anthropological level. It's really an unreadable book. I don't recommend anyone ever touch it. For one thing, significance for us, Bedeutsamkeit, can wax and wane, emerge in a different way in a different historical world. So it must be something like an emerging event, not a standing state of affairs or as tied to our species form. Beings come into view as salient, given the world within which they are encountered, and then in light of Dasein's own projects within this world. All of this, even as he constantly concedes the enormous difficulty of somehow getting into view what allows anything at all to come into view in its significance as it matters. There are, of course, regions of such beings which call for different modes of attentiveness and so different modes of accessibility and differentiated kinds of significance. There are tools, equipment, weapons, other human beings, nature, art objects, cities, books, and so forth. And they are all beings. And so, despite their differences, assume an understanding of beings as such and worldhood as such as the conditions of their availability, and so are all subject to a common interrogation of the possibility of such significance. Beings don't have this familiar signification in isolation, but within a horizon of possible meaningfulness, that is, within the world. So the world is the condition for the possible accessibility of beings, but the world can never become an object, a being in the world. In that sense, it's not available in the way that things are within the world. It's another formulation of the so-called ontological difference. We want to know what the worldhood of a world consists in, such that anything can be assessed as a being, that can be assessed as a being, depends on such a prior horizon. But we have to reckon with this element of our finitude. As he claims, we can never look upon the phenomenon of the world directly. It is true that even here, we could extract some content from a given interpretation of the phenomenon of world without reference to its indicative character and set it out in an objective definition, which could then be passed on. Kind of historical anthropology would do that. But this would deprive the interpretation of all its reliable power, since whoever seeks to understand would not then be heeding the directive that lies in every philosophical concept, the presupposition of the world. That is, the problem of the worldhood of the world, in effect, names the problem of the meaningfulness of being as such. And so, likewise, as the condition for such meaningfulness, its availability is as disclosed in some kind of opening up or unconcealing event, not as the content of any judgment, nor as empirically encounterable within the world. The combination of the world's centrality and the relative cognitive unavailability of the world is what produces what Heidegger refers to as a kind of homesickness or an uncanniness, an unease at our being always subject to such a world into which we are thrown, but which we cannot redeem through transcendence, make sense of theoretically, or directly articulate. The source of how things have come to matter collectively at a time is hidden and needs to be, even if partially and indirectly, unconcealed, as he said, disclosed. This is so, even though, to repeat the most important point, such worldhood is not a source we have any extra worldly access to. Anyone for whom anything matters knows that such mattering cannot be understood primarily as a result of any prior reflection on what ought to matter. That's the problem of transcendence. And if there is some general horizon for the possibility of anything mattering at a time, Any attempt to thematize it and render it the content of a judgment would always presuppose it and would have to be intra-worldly. In a way parallel to his notion of thrownness in being and time, we always already find ourselves in a world, in a horizon of possible mattering, and this mark of our finitude should be reflected in metaphysics. And as Heidegger explores more and more later in his career, artworks can also serve, together with historical crises and fundamental attunements, as moments of such disclosure. Poetry, creative literature, is nothing but the elementary emergence into words, the becoming uncovered of existence as being in the world. For the others who before it were blind, the world first becomes visible by what is thus spoken. It doesn't mean emerges as an articulate content of a judgment. So what does poetry or creative literature disclose with respect to this project of the horizon of meaningfulness? Well, it's like something we see out of the corner of our eye in reading Rilke or Proust or Trockle or Hölderlin, or all the things in Heidegger's career after the 1940s. He tried to articulate without falling back into the paradox of interpretation, very familiar paradox in literary criticism. Perhaps I should say what that is. Take Shakespeare's sonnet. My love is nothing like the sun. No, her lips, no coral is, her lips are not as red as any coral. My love is nothing. So you're teaching undergraduates Shakespeare's sonnet, my love is nothing like the sun. And somebody asks you, what does he mean by that? And you say, well, he means, my love is, she's not really all that beautiful, but it's okay. It's all right. She's okay. She's acceptable. She's not the sun, but what would you have missed? I mean, the student would be justified in saying, well, why am I taking a Shakespeare course? Why doesn't he just say, I got this girlfriend and she's not very pretty, but I like her? Well, you'd miss, this is very hard to say what you'd miss. There's a kind of pathos and rejection of the very concept of having to be like the sun in that formulation. But even that is a distortion of the original. But that's what you have to do in the exfoliation of a complex literary object, is keep trying to hint indirectly or out of the side of your eye or in a way that you can't formulate directly what you would be missing if you did formulate it directly. It's not easy to do. And, if the student submits a paper and says, this is what it means, and you say C-, the student comes to you and says, well, what's the right answer? I say, well, I haven't done a very good job as a teacher, but that's the wrong question. And boy, that's what Heidegger is trying to say about philosophy's attention to the meaningfulness of being. They're onto it in the wrong way. They're trying to say what it is in a way that has to distort it. Well, sorry for the digression. But that's the topic of the last lecture. This is a quotation. Touch anything. It's also, thank you. It's also the case that any such emergence, if it's to be disclosed, requires the right kind of responsiveness from Dasein, a kind of thinking Heidegger will begin to call in all kinds of unusual ways a gathering, a focusing, a development of possibilities, as when the Platonic philosophical world emerged and eventually the horizon of meaningfulness was restricted to logos, understood as ratio, prevailed. This is exactly the kind of disclosure, the emergence of a contingent horizon of significance that Heidegger wants to show us paradoxically obscures and even denies its own conditions for such a possible intelligibility, assuming instead as original what is derivative or founded. This would be the assumption that access to beings as substances, continual substances through time, itself understood as a measurable sequence of nows, wherein our responsiveness is modeled on sight primarily, and the question of meaningfulness is either lost or treated as the result of reflection and projections, as his critique of subjectivity, or ignores the conditions under which reflectiveness itself comes to matter, discursivity and articulateness, in such a primordial way in the world we live in. I'm relying heavily on this construal of Heidegger's project, that at its center is this concern with the availability of beings and their significance, that this is what he's after in asking for the meaning of being, its meaningfulness. This means that when he mentions the, quote, originary and unarticulated and unaccentuated multiplicity of what being already means, he's not talking about the need for a criterion to clearly demarcate what significantly exists from what doesn't. Again, he notes frequently there certainly would be entities without Dasein, and he repeats that Dasein's mode of being is care. Moreover, when he's discussing in the fundamental concepts of metaphysics, what he considers one of these fundamental attunements I mentioned before, boredom, he's describing what he calls a disclosive event, disclosive of the possible meaningfulness of being in its failure. And that can be manifest in boredom precisely because of the massive failure of any continual investment in, commitment to, or care about, in the worst cases, anything at all. In what he calls fundamental boredom, beings do not show up as what they are in any salience of significance, but in what he calls a kind of emptiness, indifference, being held in limbo, being left in the lurch, in Stichgelassen, in being's refusal of our meaningful involvement. For example, rather it is boring for one, it is thus for one, has in itself this character of manifesting how things stand concerning for us, unworthy of our attachment. This attunement brings us ourselves into the possibility of an exceptional understanding, provided precisely by virtue of this crisis. Attuning and being attuned have the intrinsic character of making manifest, and manifest again in its failure. This does not exhaust the essence of attunement. Now, it's a very big and general claim, but the inheritance of the metaphysical tradition that I talked about yesterday, the way the world seems to us fundamentally or originally available, is a world that is fundamentally, and this is a funny thing to say, boring. It is not the kind of world, for example, the world of science and technology, that attracts our love of it, our care for it, our concern with it. If that's what's primordial, then it creates a kind of crisis in which this problem of meaningfulness is lost. And most lives subject to this horizon, what he calls the technological enframing of the modern world, we could summarize this whole project by saying, becomes boring. He said, well, most of the people I know are not bored. They have love affairs, they have marriages, they have children, and so on. But that all has to be within a context of labor, work, consumption, technology, the earth, a whole bunch of things that affect how those primary matters of concern are experienced and which make them susceptible to failing of themselves. When we ask ourselves, why does it all matter? Why don't I go to Tahiti and become a painter? The kind of answers we give to that are answers we inherit from the context of meaningfulness we find ourselves. Given that emphasis on our primary access to the meaning of being as such is an attunement, not a theoretical or observational claim, and given this focus through boredom, it's clearly the case that Heidegger is tracking how things mean to us now, how things stand concerning us as a matter of mattering that could contingently collapse and thereby reveal itself in its meagerness. Our initiation into any historical world primarily is an initiation into this regime of matter. When we learn language as children, we do not only learn intuitively the rules of grammar, but we learn in a different way the pragmatics of the language. What point there would be in saying such a thing in such a context, what effect an expression might be expected to have, how aspects of rhetoric work, when it is better to say nothing. Language use is normative, but not only grammatical, but in the matter of its proprieties. That is, we are implicitly attuned to proprieties or meaningfulness and significances in daily exchanges with others. Being so attuned is not incompatible with disregarding or challenging such assumed norms. In fact, it's a necessary condition of doing so. Likewise, when we learn a task like cooking, we learn the normative proprieties of the art, what utensils are for, how best to use them, what makes for good seasoning, good time management, best techniques, mise en place, etc. We learn to understand the relation between eating and dining and the place of food and cooking and rituals of family and social life. We don't just learn the technique. In this and in many other domains, all the beings we are encountered within a world in which public proprieties have come to prevail, and we are onto these not by having beliefs about them or as a result of explicit evaluations, but through already being in a world, coping with other beings and other Daseins in our comportment, and as Heidegger keeps saying, a practical mode of access everywhere still normative. Moreover, the greatest possible contrast Heidegger wants to draw is between his approach and a way of dealing with beings that is common to modern science, capitalist consumerism, its reduction to exchange value, and everyday thoughtlessness, all of which has involved what we called yesterday the logical prejudice, that only what is fit to be the content of an assertion can count as a meaningful being. The result is a kind of leveling of meaningfulness to mere presence and a prioritizing in our involvement of only one dimension of care, efficient mutual satisfaction of interest. It is still difficult and perhaps impossible, because it goes against the essence of the matter, to extract a common meaning as a universal generic concept under which these modes of the is could be classified as a species. However, a definite unitary trait runs through all these meanings. It points our understanding of to be towards a definite horizon by which the understanding is fulfilled. The boundary drawn around the sense of being stays within the sphere of presentness and presence, subsistence, and substance. The result is that in everyday life, we board the tram, talk to other people, call the dog, look up at the stars, all in the same way. Humans, vehicles, human beings, animals, heavenly bodies, everything in the same uniformity of what is present at hand. This is paradoxical. This event, what being has come to mean, what is present at hand, is actually a complex denial of its richer meaningfulness. Complex because it involves a forgetfulness of our own original availability, and also because it requires a meaning bestowal useful for us. Being as standing reserved, mere material for technological manipulation, or a kind of meaninglessness, has emerged as its significance. And this prevails even while our experience in the world everywhere manifests saliences of significance that belie the dominant notion of being at present at hand in subsistence, which we somehow have forgotten to notice. Now, this distinction is not entirely clear, but because it's also the case that with respect to science, science is also a practical engagement with the world in which things show up for it as concernful, meaningful, within the enterprise of science itself. And there is a Heideggerian philosopher of science at Wesleyan, a very good one, Joseph Rouse, who's tried to argue that there's a way of thinking of the project of science in Heideggerian terms, not as just the empirical discovery of various facts about the world, but as a concernful engagement practically with the world, although Rouse himself admits that from Heidegger's point of view, it reduces the horizon of significance in a way that Heidegger thinks is an inheritance from the metaphysical tradition, but we don't need to go into that now. We'll talk about it in discussion. I should also signal here finally that with respect to Hegel, we will have to revisit the issue of a logical prejudice tomorrow and examine in some detail whether Hegel, as the culmination of all philosophy and the source of this contrast with another way of thinking about the meaningfulness of being, is actually something Hegel and the culmination of philosophical tradition is guilty of. After all, just to give you one kind of example of what Heidegger might have ignored in what we were talking about yesterday, Hegel relies in his phenomenology of spirit on such non-disclosive moments of disclosure as the famous struggle to the death for recognition, which is certainly not an exchange of judgmental claims, not a way of reasoning with another human being. The fact that for both, at least from a high altitude, the distinctiveness of human life emerges for both Heidegger and Hegel in a confrontation with and a response to one's own death is a deep point of similarity between both of them, which is another non-discursive form of disclosure. We can talk about that in discussion if you want. Hegel's view that a human becomes a human being, transcends its animal status in risking its life for something that has no natural value, like the status of a recognized person, a person worthy of esteem and respect. The experience, for example, of forgiveness in his chapter critical of the standpoint of morality and the disclosive roles for religious experience in the phenomenology prior to its transformation to theology and the appeals in the phenomenology of Hegel to literary moments, like Diderot's Rameau's nephew, as some sense disclosive, are further points of contact that Hegel presents and that Heidegger doesn't discuss. As we said yesterday, though, for Hegel, moments like this are, however important, incomplete, subject to the kind of abuse Hegel worries about with appeals to conscience. One man's disclosure is another man's delusion. And he relies on no such experiential basis in the book that he considered his most important, The Science of Logic. But at this point, that's an open issue, which we'll discuss on Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have time for questions. Well, Sebastian,
thank you very much. I just have a question regarding Heidegger's critique of the two-step way. So I think this has also has to do with the two-step process or determination that Hegel does in the Science of Logic of pure being, things such as indeterminate, undifferentiated, and unmediated, and then becoming essence, right? Which is, the determinate being or being with meaning. But it also seems to be the case that Heidegger has a two-step thing as well. That is hidden meaning, and then an unhidden meaningfulness of being. So I don't know if that's correct, or if it stands as a two-step process for Heidegger.
Yeah, it's a good question. They're different two steps.
Okay.
The first question, the one Heidegger is objecting to, involves the question of the original availability of the world at all. And in that sense, there's no two steps. The availability of beings, how they make sense to us, and our original encounter with them, is not a matter of what we would call simple objectivity. They're present at handness. They're always already involved in some context of meaningfulness. Now, the fact that the actual context of meaningfulness, what Heidegger calls the world, is not discursively statable and has to be approached by this new form of thinking in order to be revealed, is in fact something that goes beyond the original obscure experience. But that doesn't bear on the first question, if I'm making my point clear. It's the second question. The world is still available to us only in its Bedeutsamkeit, in its significance. What that significance is, to be explored by philosophy, is not a question that arises in the possible availability of the world at all. That's a separate question for metaphysics, for philosophy, or for poetic thinking, for literature, for disclosure. So it's not as if we first, in our actual originary familiar experience with the world, encounter something that has a kind of meaningfulness whose source is obscure, and then in that experience itself, take a second step to ask, I wonder why that matters to me, or something like that. That's not the way it happens in this originary experience.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. At some point, I will not today or lectures, I would like to say something about underlying language, because the way in which you presented is wonderfully clear. And one asks oneself what is the relationship between constructive reality and the way in which that's a secondary that's a question. What I would like to ask you today is the following. So it seems to me that there are the tension of two things that you are saying at the same time. With my one thing I would hesitate, I think, to describe as transcendental. And because you speak of conditions of possibilities, and you think that the world is what it is, we all engage in cognitive things, and etc. So it doesn't change the world. But we understand better what it is to be in the world. But there is also the second aspect, which is linked with what we call the shtick of philosophy to some kind of other things, which Heidegger is politics thinking, and which is not presented because it is by itself, it's things that are renewable and our everyday activities and so on. And so perhaps another way to formulate the question is the following. We quoted this phrase from Heidegger concepts of metaphysics. Perhaps I don't know if you can start off from the stream again. So I really, poetry, literature is nothing but an elementary emergence in plurals. Okay. So I hope you will say something about cinema. But the becoming unappropriate, so unitarian, the becoming unappropriate of existence as being in the world. And my question is, shouldn't it be Heidegger writing the becoming incorporated of existence as modalities of being in the world? Because it seems to me that there is a lot of difference if you engage in imitation, at the ontic level, if you want, or if you remain at the transcendental level. Now, when Heidegger interprets Hölderlin or Celan or some very specific objects, what he discovers is himself. Mm. So that's the becoming the uncovering of existence as being in the world. And is that interpreting anti-facts?
Yeah, let me first deal with the transcendental question. Kant invented, as you know, the notion of a transcendental philosophy in which what we're talking about are trying to establish the necessary conditions for the possibility of experience. And Kant thought in the highest principle of synthetic judgments, the conditions of the possibility of experience are at the same time the conditions for the possibility of objects of experience. This is Kant's version of the identity of thinking and being, of logic as metaphysics, but only a metaphysics of experience. But for Kant to have established this required what he considered the greatest labor ever undertaken in philosophy. That is, to claim that this is true, that the conditions of experience categories are at the same time the conditions of the object of experience. It requires a transcendental deduction. And a transcendental deduction is a logical argument trying to show, by kind of reductio, what would have to be the case if this weren't true. In my view, that's the basic strategy of the transcendental deduction. What he tries to establish is that there could not be any unity of experience at all, any coherent, continuous I having an experience over time, if this were not the case. That's a deductive argument. Heidegger is trying to shift the question about the relationship between the world as the horizon of possibility and that which instantiates those possibilities from a deductive transcendental relation to a phenomenological primordiality issue. So his demonstration of the way in which the world functions as a horizon of meaningfulness is not functioning in an argument that relies on a kind of reductio deduction of what would be the case if it weren't the case. He's trying to show us, and in a way, what bothers philosophers about this is that a phenomenological attempt at a disclosure of what is primordial in our experience as opposed to secondary doesn't have fixed truth conditions. It's not possible when we want to know whether something reveals or discloses something to formulate what it reveals or discloses in the form of traditional philosophical proposition. So that's already a problem. I will try to address that on Friday. But it's this primordiality rather than deductivity that is supposed to distinguish his account from the transcendental. Now, the second account is much more complicated. I mean, one could even put your question in a stronger way. Doesn't Heidegger claim to know how things are possibly available? Even if he uses this unusual phenomenological method, what kind of knowledge is that? I mean, being in time and the fundamental concepts of metaphysics are articulated in discursive judgments, which contain propositions. All right. Now, Heidegger's claim is that the point of this discursivity, which we can't talk in any other way except in propositions, which we assert in judgments. The point of it is a very tricky concept in being in time. The point of it is not to articulate something outside of thought that thought reveals as present at hand. He thinks of philosophical thinking as what he calls Hinweis, pointing. Controversial, easy to object to it, but it's not meant to disclose something that is the case. It's meant to point to something, just as the task of metaphysics is to awaken us to something we've forgotten. That's a very different kind of, it's true that he has to rely in any phenomenological account on what it is like for us. And that means what it's like for him, or what it's like for Rilke, or what it's like for Hölderlin. And the question emerges then, whence the generality of the result, that the disclosure has some bearing on what must be for beings to be available? Why isn't it just how they show up for Hölderlin, how they show up for Heidegger, how they show up for Rilke? Again, that's very similar to the question of how we try to formulate actual truth conditions for this pointing. We can't. I mean, we just have to admit that. Although we have to depend on this if we're to make any progress in understanding how things show up for us as meaningful. So it is a dilemma for Heidegger. I mean, if somebody says, I don't find myself subject to this kind of, I find myself completely able to articulate the way things have value to me because of the way I value them, because of the reasons I have for valuing them. I don't know what he's talking about. Right? So this enormous enterprise of trying to give us examples, articulate what is primordial or fundamental, these two questions are linked: the rejection of the transcendental approach and the reliance on the primordiality phenomenology, and the question of the status of truth in the phenomenological disclosures he claims to have unveiled. And that question is the question of generality. How does film or literature or poetry bear on us in a way that has more to do than with the descriptions of what it is like experience for the poet or the novelist or the filmmaker? I concede that's a big problem that Heidegger owes us an answer to.
If I just remind me again, say if your explanation, from my half of trying to figure out what this perspective of two is because practical. Because you mentioned that the engagement must be a practical one, right? Because of the world. But then you mentioned again in your you mentioned that there is another. Again, you mentioned that it is practical, but there is a practicality also in science and political science. So if there's a difference, I've always wondered, and you reminded me of that question again, whether it is this care, this urgence to disclose being or something along those lines is an ethical one. Let me put it bluntly, or perhaps in Kantian terms. I mean, there is a duty for us that we have to disclose being or anything like that, but it's just a matter of fact, in the sense that, well, we are just this type of beings, we are Daseins or something.
Yeah.
And so that's something that we just do, and then there's no, because the first one sounds like a lot like a Kantian or a Beyontic sort of ethics or duty, moral duty or something like that. And the other one is just the description that you mentioned already by passing it, a descriptive science of philosophical anthropology or anything like that. And as far as I can recall, Heidegger denied both claims. I mean, this is not an ethical duty,
just descriptive science or anything of that sort. So I tend to like to please clarify this to many people if you want. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for the question. This is a fraught question in Heidegger, because there are two ways of criticizing his involvement with National Socialism. One is that he was just politically an idiot, an anti-Semite, a bad man, an opportunist, a jerk, it was just and it had nothing to do with his philosophy. This is like Richard Rorty's interpretation. Well, actually, there are three ways. The second way is to claim there is something in the Heideggerian project that would tempt him in a way that's consistent with that project to the radicality of National Socialism. And the evidence for this is that after being in time, or after the 1930s, after his involvement with the party, Heidegger came to start discussing as the being to whom being means something, not as Dasein, but as das Volk, a community. And then that led Heidegger to the question, what constitutes a community? And that led him to the root and boding of the blood and earth. The finitude of human being means that our community, that is, that world of which we are a part, within which things can mean what they mean, has this kind of contingent historical national destiny. So that's a question in itself. What does he mean by this? And the final way of dealing with this ethical question of his own involvement in a horrendously unethical enterprise is that there may not be an eternal connection between his philosophy and what he did, but there's nothing, and goes to your question, there's nothing in his philosophy and the way he approaches philosophy that could give us reasons for not doing it. But it's just a pure phenomenology of hermeneutic effectivity in a way that I don't agree with any of those, although I certainly agree that Heidegger interpreted his own philosophy. And this, in a way, one could talk about this in more general terms than in just Heidegger, because much of modern European intellectual thought, not just in philosophy, but in cultural criticism and in literature, modernism, after the First World War, was the literature of disaster, crisis, of catastrophe. And anytime there is this pervading mood of a general civilizational enterprise having failed, the temptation for a radical rejectionism and an enormously revolutionary new beginning, which is obviously a kind of leap into the future, is dangerously tempting. And that's why so many of the high literary modernists were, one could say conservative, but we'll have to say, Edward Pound, D.S. Eliot, the enterprise of literary radicality, modernism, has an inherent kind of right-wing bias because of this feeling that the civilizational enterprise of enlightenment has failed, and the evidence is the First World War, and if we needed any more evidence, it's the Second World War. It just didn't work, and hence something radically different. That does tempt Heidegger, but there is still a normative dimension in Heidegger that one can detect in a work, even though we wouldn't call it ethics. The way in which we're living now is not suitably appropriate for the kind of being we are. We're living in a way that is a betrayal of what is fundamentally significant about human beings, openness to meaningfulness. That has been foreclosed in the tradition we live in, and it's a catastrophe. Nihilism is an ethical thing. It means we have been given no way in which the world can matter to us, except as manipulable objects for our own collective will. That has to be called something like an ethical failure in the modern enterprise. What it would be to live in a way that would do justice to that. I'm afraid here Heidegger is very, very tempted by the same thing you see in Nietzsche, which is this recovery is possible only for an elite. And the task of philosophy is to make the political and social situation of the world safe for this elite. which is in a way a residue of making how you understood Platonism. That the only really satisfying form of life available for humans is available to an elite. So, although there is this kind of ethical dimension in being and time, the project of a human life lived out in accordance with the way Heidegger thinks is only available rarely. It's not necessarily an intellectual elite, a philosophically informed elite. It's a cultural elite in a way, just as available to people who are sensitive to poetry or people who are poets. But it's nonetheless an elite. I don't consider that an adequate ethical answer to the situation that Heidegger does, but I don't.
Thank you very much. Nothing's way of being and this original unconcealment of the world reminded me something along the lines of the mystic tradition, in which the meaning that shows up or appears to the mystic subject and resists being conceptually grasped or to even put into words. And so I was just thinking, is there any of that in Heidegger, or is there a similar structure underlying Heidegger's enterprise and mystic tradition? And if it is the case, does Heidegger hold in any regard this mystic tradition and literature?
Yeah, there is. And his interest in Meister Eckhart early in his career, and his continuing interest later in the 1950s and 60s in Japanese philosophy indicates something like this. There's certainly a strain of that. But in the mystical tradition proper, in order the kind of preparation for mystical experience, that is disclosure, some sort of enlightenment that is non-discursive and unsayable, is a kind of preparation for spiritual exercises in which the experience itself is then sui generis. The only things we can say about it are what it isn't. And that's where the tradition of negative theology comes from. That is actually quite prominent in theology right now under the influence of Heidegger, when things of the work of Jean-Luc Marion, like that, or even Levinas, as these experiential moments that are ineffable, and because ineffable, sui generis, and can be prepared for only by a kind of preparation that leads us to it, but then the experience itself either happens or doesn't. The difference with Heidegger is that he has this ambition to develop a different kind of language for philosophy, in which the event of the disclosure of the unconcealed meaningfulness of being can be, if not articulated, pointed to in various ways. It's not a wholly negative theology. There is a kind of poetic thinking in which this experience of what we are subject to as we are thrown into a world of significance can be, again, if not articulated, at least given some kind of philosophical expression, rather than just preparation for a mystical experience.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So my question is twofold. I would like to know if Heidegger considers the role of history on becoming aware of the interdependence between the world and oneself. If he criticizes the pretension of history as a science, as regarding historical events as impartial instead of interpreting them on how they have shaped our world right now, and if he suggests a way in which one can make oneself or one can attune oneself to what matters, to the same meaning, and how to do that. Is it through art? Is it through culture? Or
yeah. Well, this question of the role of history, or what Heidegger calls historicity, so let me say something about that. The difference in Heidegger between the normal academic or political study of history as an object is something that he thinks is still under the sway of the conception of the disclosure or articulation of what we need to know as an object of a science. political science, political history, intellectual history, social history. That's an enterprise that we think still, which supposes the meaning of being we have inherited from Western metaphysics, that history is an object of knowledge, and that there are descriptive claims that are backed by empirical evidence about why social change occurs, why revolution occurs, why intellectual movement died out, what conditions associated with thought over rival new culture or tradition, what Heidegger calls undefined. It doesn't claim that they can't go on because they're not fundamental, they're not fundamental. What we need in philosophy to understand is not history as an object of study, but history. By which you mean something like, again, it will have to be pure as an initial path of the vision, but the event of the historicizing. Remember, it's really a big issue that I'm not talking about in these lectures, but it's obviously the name of the book is Being and Time. And the fundamental thesis of the book is that the meaningfulness of being is temporal in a way that isn't a matter of successive events that are objects of explanation. That there are these mysterious happenings. The Greek Enlightenment failed, not because of the random occupation of the entire Western world, but because of the intellectual breakdown visible in Greek tragedy. We agree with Nietzsche about this. But that's an event that has a legacy. But the problem is, as you indicated in the question, one of interpretation, not explanation. So, and the events of interpretation, what we're trying to do is not to understand in kind of causal way why the Greek view of the world, or the Roman view of the world, or the early Christian view of the world no longer has any grip on this. Right? But it's to try to understand how this contingent event has been inherited by us in a way that shapes how things show up for us as significant now. That's an interpretive enterprise. And you should think our historicity is something like the events of historical, how dependent we are on historical moments of disclosure that can't be given an articulated account. Or this is, for example, very different from something like a Marxist or neo-Marxist conception of history. We're trying to understand, why did capitalism occur? What was it about the breakdown of the feudal system that was inevitable, necessary, result of its own contradiction, that led not to a different form of economic organization, but specifically to capitalism? That's not a kind of question Heidegger is interested in. Because again, from all I've been saying, things are the secondary question. But even if it's secondary, we're owed an account of how this general critique of metaphysics is supposed to help us understand ourselves in a world of exploitation, income inequality, consumerist culture. It's just like a one-shot deal, Heidegger say, for all metaphysics and present. Now we need a much more refined interpretation, even if aspects of the interpretation are secondary. I don't know if this is responsive to the question. It's a big issue that what Heidegger thinks of as the essential historicizing nature of meaningfulness for John Donaldson. And it raises the problem of relativism and contingency right at all that we're also discussing.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very
much. Thursday here. Thank you very much.
You could just download the other two.